Shall I shout? Okay. My name's Fred. I've slightly changed my presentation yesterday. I'm going to talk about the place and city to place. So one of the things that came out yesterday is that you all do great projects, what I would call citizens projects. I worked in government and I work in research, but I hate universities and I hate government. I try and act as a broker so that, because what I think is really interesting stuff comes from citizens and it doesn't get recognised by the government. So what I try and work on is to create tools to explain to government the great stuff that people do. So for me it was really stimulating yesterday because you have projects that I can take back to people and say, look, this is what things should be. I'm currently working on this, so that's on City 2.0. So what I'm going to talk about, if I get this to work. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about what the places are, some history, this project and what that ties into it. City 2.0, a citizens project I'm working on. How many people have heard of smart cities?
Sure.
Smart cities? Okay, so the big tech companies are trying to redesign cities so they can sell more tech to the city, and it's to sell technology. It's a 1.6 billion pound, 1.6 billion euro European project, but they're excluding people from the process of that, and I'm trying to design tools to bring people back into that design process. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts because I mostly get kicked out of universities, but I've been made a fellow. I'm a research fellow at the London Knowledge Lab because I know how to talk to government, but mostly what I do is social improv. A lot of what I do came from work we did in Lewisham in the 90s, which was the first local authority, part of London, as Paul was explaining, to say, actually the internet can change the way citizens behave. So let's see what we can do. What does a citizen let us do? And it's a kind of crowdsourced project with the people of Lewisham. And we developed a number of green projects and a number of internet projects, which was so interesting that I got a job in the government. I was head of community projects at Lewisham College, which was about outreach between education and the local authority. And I worked for the government for 8 years on how to build digital community centres, because I was the only person that knew how to do it. And what I learned at that time is nobody in government knows anything, so you just have to improvise and make stuff up. Although I worked in a lot of ministries, as you can see from that list there. I noticed yesterday that your validation comes from your projects. I don't normally say this bit because I say people I'm some posh guy with connections, but actually I started by being involved in the longest occupation in UK history. We occupied the university for 5 months and occupied the canteen and ran it as a workers' co-op for 5 years. And so everything I learned came from running a university as a social anarchist co-op. So the rest of my life has been trying to create social anarchism wherever I go. So that's kind of my modus operandi. Do stuff, reflect on it and change. I don't think you teach people. I think you have to do stuff and you learn from that. You learn from reflecting on doing mad things, like everyone in this room does. So actually there's a much better talk that I gave a few months ago in Bristol. I'm working with Bristol and a group called Stokes Croft, which is the kind of cool part of Bristol. And it's a bit like Hoxton, but it's like where the trip-hop bands come from. And they're kind of redesigning the way that they work in Bristol. So I've got a much better talk, which is much better than me recording this. So I'll give a link to this, Designing Participatory Smart Cities. All my work is trying to create an intervention between government and municipalities and people, and getting government and municipalities to recognise the stuff that people do by putting it in the language that they understand. So if I say stupid words, it's because that's what government understands. So one of the things I was involved in, when I was kicked out of the occupation, I had to work, so I worked as a van driver in Covent Garden. How many people know Covent Garden? So it's kind of the main tourist centre when you're a tourist when you go to London. Actually it came out of an anarchist occupation because when the City of London burned down in 1666, Covent Garden was already a square that existed built in 1649. This is as it was back in the day. Effectively, it was redesigning the city around squares where the square itself was a third place. And when the medieval City of London burned down, the plan to rebuild London was around public third places. But in 1971, because it became the fruit market, the fruit and veg market, I used to deliver stuff in vans. The plan was to turn it into a conference centre and tower blocks, like Docklands is now. There was a big occupation, and what we learned was, if you can occupy a place that property developers want for 2 years, they run out of patience or run out of money, and then you can actually do interesting things. So it started in about 71, it lasted until 74. So The Common Garden that you see today was because a bunch of anarchists and squatters took that place over and kept it as the original design it was back in 1649. And then later on I was living in Lewisham. There was a similar thing to regenerate Lewisham around the creek. That's the creek as it was. Deptford Creek, part of Lewisham, was the last tidal creek because they dammed up and blocked all of the rivers, like the Fleet River, for example, in London. And the plan was to turn it into a high-end marina, like Chelsea Marina. But again, because we spent a couple of years protesting, loads of people get involved in that, we said what we need to do is to keep this as a tidal creek, because it's the last tidal creek. And there's a bunch of urban ecologists that are involved in that, saying it's a much more interesting way of using the city to keep the ecological dimension than to build a marina for rich people to stick their boats into. And I was involved in developing this Creekside Centre after we kind of won the Tidal Creek battle. And that, it's really interesting because we're just a bunch of volunteers. And we thought, well, we've learned a lot from being urban ecology activists. What we'll do is create a centre to show people how to do that kind of thing. And when the Olympic bid came on, who's heard of the London Olympics? Nobody's heard of the London Olympics? Wow, okay. It was on telly and Usain Bolt ran a lot of meters very quickly. We were the only building in London. London is about property development, tower blocks and the Shard and all of that, right? We were the only people that built a building to the IOC Sustainable Development Standards. A bunch of unpaid volunteers. So that went into the Olympic bid because we were the only building that was green, recognised as a green building. So it's amazing what you can do if you're an occupier and an anarchist and you just don't take shit from anyone. And this is Paul's project. One of the things that came out of keeping the Tidal Creek is the River Waste project, is that they diverted the Tidal Creek into various parks and turned it into an ecology centre. Lewisham is often thought as being the poorest borough in London. People in Westminster will get on a train because in 10 minutes they can get from the Houses of Parliament into Lewisham, which is the poorest place to live in London. And that is the middle of the poorest place to live in London, thanks to Paul. Thanks to some other crazy people as well. So that's, and recently we've just been celebrating on the BBC on the Culture Show. After 20 years of struggle, this is what happened. A guy from the TV came up and reporting on all the work we've done said, out of nowhere, suddenly Deptford is a cultural centre. Does anyone recognise that building with the cultural regeneration? It's the Laban Dance Centre. People know the Laban Dance Centre. So what happened is, so we had the anchor building that Manuel talked about yesterday for the Creekside Centre, but also there were lots of abandoned warehouses because it was by a river. They got taken over by artists. It became an artistic centre. There was a thing called the South London Art Walk that happens once a month, which is all the galleries stay open late in the evening. And BBC heard about it and said, "Oh no, this place has become cool." I'm an anarchist and I learned everything I did about building cities from Kropotkin. It's fantastic. Well, anyone been to Barcelona? I think Barcelona is cool. Barcelona is as cool as it is because it was kind of anarchist co-ops running about 75 years, about 1875 too, until Franco came along. But the basic design of Barcelona is kind of anarchist. So let's say some stuff about the third place. So anarchists are actually great at organising stuff, it just takes a long time for the change now. So, back to the official talk that I was going to give before I found you were all anarchists, so other potentially from the government. So, third place means not the home, not work, but it's a place where you go to build community. I'm talking definitionally here, you can disagree. So, I'm interested in how do we use digital society tools to create new communities. I actually was head of community programs for the British government, which is an amazing thing. They put that in how to build community in the UK. Wonderfully, when we were doing our work on the toolbox for the Oozing project, this is what Daniela put up, thank you Daniela. Step one in her project is sharing community through participatory governance. So that's what we're doing in the European project, we're trying to show ways of doing this. So getting serious, this is from Oldenburg on Wikipedia, because I'm too lazy to find the real authority. And Wikipedia like me, so that's okay. I don't like them. Characteristics of the third place, it should be. So this is to give a kind of taxonomy, and I'm against taxonomies, but a kind of taxonomy of what third places have, and there's some interesting points here. Free or cheap? Provides food or drink. I think you need to do more on this story. It's accessible or proximate to users, so it's about locality, and I'm part of a research group called Learner Generated Context Research Group. We're interested in using new technology to revitalise context and transform context. So for me, context is a big word. Third place is, so all of our projects are very location specific, and that's a really important dimension to what they do. Have regular members. You can find new friends and old friends there, and that mixing of the news is important. It's a welcome and comfortable place, and really important, I think, has shared purpose and value. At some point, you need to articulate this, especially if you're talking to municipalities and government. Another dimension of this, the key features of the third place are that it's a neutral ground, that it's not owned, so it's not a gated community, it's an open community. Really important in the UK, where we still suffer from this idiotic class system that means that drunk members of the Bullying Club from Oxford basically run the English government, you know, Boris Johnson and the Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer. We actually have problems with getting rid of hierarchy, so the great thing about third place is that it's non-hierarchical, and typically British pubs are places that you go to meet people from other classes and other things. You know, you share an interest in beer. I used to work in a real ale cooperative making organic beer, but I don't anymore. It's accessible to everybody, so you know, barriers to entry, it's not a club, and it's a place for conversation. I think all of society comes out of conversation, and education comes out of conversation. So places that you can create where you have conversation are really powerful. So you could describe it as a public space for social mixing. And one of the things in the Uzu project, we're discussing values, is that we're trying to create transformative places, and our academic, Manuel, who's not here, so I should be rude about him, says you can't create transformative places, and I'd say yes you can. Actually, that's what third place is. It's potentially transformative because it's a mix. Because I do a lot with digital, but interested in the digital parallels to the third place, and there's a great woman called Caroline Haythornthwaite's done a lot of work on social networks. Not so much social networks as we understand it, like Facebook, but the networks of people being social. And a thing that comes out on both of those dimensions is the notion of strong ties and weak ties. How many people have heard of strong ties and weak ties? So what digital social networks enable is a lot more weak ties, i.e. people that you don't know, but for some way you've got some kind of similar like if it's Facebook. And there's some research, but I couldn't find it to give you the direct reference, but there's research that shows that innovation, which is the buzzword that everybody's interested in, or creative change or economic change comes, there's a sweet spot where you have a useful mix of strong and weak ties, so people that you know and people that you don't know. If you're in a group with everyone you know, you will think the same, you tend not to do anything original. If you're in a group with nobody that you know, nothing gets started, so you need a mix of the strange and the familiar. So I see that third places, if you divide them right, in offering community, they enable change. Enable's a big thing, we try and enable stuff happen. That's a load of stuff from an American guy, so I'll ignore that. But it's useful. One of the things we did, so I was working in government, and we were creating these kind of new centres. We got some money to research it, well, no interesting story, but I won't go into that, to find out what made them work. And they were not formal places, they were kind of new places, kind of drop-in centres with digital tools. And we got some great researchers involved in that, who, because it was something new, used an approach where they didn't ask people questions, they just got them to tell stories. And it's quite a long story for sure. We found that what made the community centre work was not having a learning agenda, but to reflect the local needs, to have what we ended up calling a community development model of learning. That if you said to local people, we've got a new learning centre there, they would come to it if they could see that that community itself would benefit. So if you had crashes, if it was training people getting back into jobs, or actually they wrote the curriculum of what you did. And I gave a talk in German to this at the Digital Integration Institute. I'm not allowed to talk about in England, but the Germans will listen, so hello to Christoph. We actually developed a model here, which you might want to use. This is not a very good version, because when I was kicked out of government, they stole all my stuff, and I had to scrape this off the web, so this is a poor version of it. But, in terms of what we're doing, I won't go through the whole thing, but this bit is how a centre works, and that's how you can link with digital technology. It's kind of a model of stigmergic learning, which we've been talking about. But one of the things we found is actually that the community is the curriculum. If you let the community decide what it wants to do, it will do stuff, and that's what it should be doing. So it seems to me that's kind of what you guys are doing with it. with your places. So that's kind of what my job is. Can I find out what you're doing and modelling it in some way, which can then get academic respectability, which we then take to government? Because I found when I was in government, I could only do stuff if I could point to the research. So what I now do is I write the research so I can point to the stuff that I want to do. Just change that basis. So a bit of history, we've done that. So if you look at all the significant institutions in history, they actually come from third places. So this is a bit of the British. The University of Paris, I was involved in Occupy of the universities, and because I had a lot of experience of Occupy, I told them that they were sort of rubbish occupation and they should actually be more community-centred. And there was a lot of different phases of Occupy, but do people know the Impact Hub Westminster in London? They ran a weekend after this called the University Project, which was like, can we co-design, co-create a new kind of university? And I have a project on that called WikiQuals, which you can steal if you want, or I can help you set it up. But one of the things we found is actually, before universities existed, what you had was communities of scholars. It was self-organised learning groups. And the University of Paris, being French, of course they want to institutionalise everything, is that they set up the University of Paris because the people that were doing learning as a hobby, this is back in the 11th century, actually went to different towns to be around a mentor of some kind. So a bit like Socrates in the original academy, people went there because Socrates was there, they wanted to talk to a cool guy, because he was then, before he took the poison. And what they saw was that students bring, or communities of scholars, bring money to a place. So universities were set up to institutionalise self-organised learning groups. Now we don't think that you can have self-organised learning groups, but actually they started off as subverting that process. My brother was a lawyer, and in the UK you become a lawyer. Anybody seen Harry Potter? So you know the dining scene in Harry Potter? That's how you become a lawyer in the UK. You go to a dinner like that, you go to 12 dinners, you become a lawyer. I kid you not. There are other things there. We've got 1660, a key thing in the development of the public institutions we have now are coffee shops, which, anyone Armenian in here? Turns out that Armenians took coffee all around Europe. I only found this out in Bucharest when I went, a friend of mine knew I liked coffee, and he said, oh, there's this place Florescu, they've been selling coffee since 1550. Because I know my coffee history. I said, 1550, that's not possible. We didn't have coffee in London until 1660. And he says, well, it was set by an Armenian. Everyone knows that Armenians invented coffee. And I was like, what? So I went online and found, yeah, it's true. The first person who was a coffee maker in the UK was an Armenian who was brought back by a scholar in Oxford who'd done the grand tour of communities of scholars, brought him back to Oxford, had him in his house as a coffee maker. People would go up to London to Oxford to have a coffee because he had a bloke, a man, who would make coffee. So a coffee maker in 1650 was a bloke. He eventually set him free. He opened a coffee shop in Oxford. He then opened a coffee shop in London. That coffee shop was where the Royal Society was invented. Anyone know the Royal Society? World's first scientific society. So, came out of the third place with an Armenian guy who travelled around Europe and made coffee for people and boom. I'm a fellow of the RSA, that started the same way. Lloyd's Insurance started in a coffee shop. Several banks started in coffee shops. So all the stuff that we think matters started in coffee shops. When I went to London, the thing that I used to do was hang out in pubs, which my dad was in the army, I lived all over the world. And pubs were where trade unions were founded, and it was a music venues. 60s music came out of pubs, punk came out of pubs. So these are all third places, and they're what I call historically liminal. They kind of exist between the present and the future, and they allow things from far and nearby to happen. I've sort of done that. Okay, so what we're doing in Uzu, do you understand this project? So Zorb, I think, the Citizens Project I'm working on is to try and legitimise and show to other municipalities kind of what Zorb are doing in their from action to process model. But what we're trying to do with Darwin from Bordeaux and Lisbon, Rojc and in the UK, actually that's what we're building. So the UK is interested in this project that we're learning from the other third place projects, how to do it. So this is what we're trying to do on the Uzu project. How can we create new third places where social entrepreneurs create socially useful enterprises, and what those terms mean, that there's multidisciplinary co-working. So that's not just co-working where you plug in and you use a digital machine, but by being in a collaborative workspace, you create mashups of different work and create new ways of working. So you try to design your own work. As Darwin is showing us, that also would help with ecological transitions to a sustainable economy that's a more ecologically balanced way of doing it, as in Bilbao, that's also engaged with the local community. It's not a self-contained place, but it's community related. And that we can build civil society. Actually, I think what these things are what I call citizen-generated context. And I'd like to live in a society of citizen-generated context, not state-generated institutions. So one of the things that I've been doing is working in this city space. People know the history of the web, right? So I kind of think that, so that's the kind of history of the web, but I think since Web 2.0 which came along in 2002, which is the participatory web, which is giving us tools to create stuff, like Wiki and YouTube and whatever that may be, that actually the technology enables us to make stuff rather than just receiving it. So we're kind of interested, what does that mean for education, what does that mean for society, what does that mean for government? And the lady who gave the talk yesterday talked about temporary uses. One of the principles, is she here today, the temporary uses thing? So we're all involved in temporary uses. In Web 2.0, that's a principle, it's called permanent beta, that actually you're forever becoming, you never actually reach that state. So and there's that great Lennon quote. John Lennon had this line that life is what happens whilst you're making plans. So you have an urban plan, but stuff happens anyway. That's actually what life is, it's not the plan. But we think you can use this technology to create architectures of participation. And the thing I'm interested in is when technology comes along, are we enabling what we already have, or are we actually transforming it into something new? So one of the things I do so what I think tech-enabled change can be socially dialogical rather than intellectually dialectical. I put that in for Anna, if she's here. And dialogical means that you don't know what the answer is, you engage in the process, and the process transforms what the answer can be. And it comes from, as I think you've been doing in the third place spaces, it's that as users you go into a space and transform that space, as we see in Rojc. It was designed as an architectural, architecture is designed as a military barracks, but it's now a centre of civil society, and that's because people have transformed it. So kind of, what you can do with tech and society. We think it can be context shaping. So one of the things that we're interested in is, because we think of things in the old ways, is can we have this phrase, problematizing the context space and inventing new solutions. Okay, so you want me to? Right, Daniela's telling me to shut down. So one of the things that we've done is we tried to turn Manchester into an interactive city. That was really interesting because we had lots of problems with the city council and stuff. So I'll go to the final year. So this is where we are. What happens at the moment is that this is what we call a development framework. It's to try and scaffold thinking about how we design the future. So if we think of the city as being a city, institutions, a street, and strategies, what we have at the moment with municipalities are City Hall, that we think buildings are all about bricks and mortars, that we engage with people on a tarmac level, at the street level, but that actually it gets dominated by cars, it's kind of car driven and it's all captured in an urban plan. What smart city tech companies are saying is, actually we have real-time City Hall, which they have in Rio, but actually their idea of a real-time City Hall is so you can have faster traffic flows and you can find out when a riot's going to happen before it happens. And I always say, actually, if you work with the people who are writing, you might not get a riot. You don't need to have data to tell you when the next riot's going to be. But it's clicks and mortars. It's links between institutions and the web in various ways. And at the street level, you put Wi-Fi and digital in, and it's built around an urban vision. We're saying, actually, you can do more with that. With Web 2.0 tools, you can make a participatory rather than a smart city. That you can have a distributed city hall. Actually, using the European principle of subsidiarity, you take decisions at the lowest level you can, you spread it out into the communities. You can build architectures of participation, which means that people can engage with the management process, not that management and people are a separate thing. You can bring them together. And with various tools, you can have context engineering. You can have context engineering tools which helps you shape that process. And actually the vision of the city should be collaborative rather than planned. But that's it. Christian reminded me of this. Steve Jobs' phrase insanely great? He says we should build insanely great products. I say we should create insanely ambitious projects. So my projects are always insanely ambitious.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Fred. I think I'm going to tell something very similar to what you've told from another point of view. My name is Christian Weiler. I'm an architect. I was also the coordinator of the first phase of the Origin Spaces project, which was the research phase, and we're now into the second phase, which is the toolbox phase. So there's new kind of coordination on that phase, but now I'm here more or less as a practitioner, as an architect, as a designer. I'm Dutch. I've been working in France for 12 years, so I'm kind of a cross-cultural hybrid being myself. I have a question also to know a little bit about what the audience is. How many people work in the creative industries?
Can you define creative?
Okay. No, that's a good question. How many people work in design? Not so many. How many people have a paid salary, who have an employer? Okay. And how many people are entrepreneurs? Okay, so because I think there's a question about governance, and I think also Fred, you might have mentioned it in your presentation, that there's a sort of a post-governance situation where we have to mix individual motivations with collective objectives, and I think for a lot, the only way out of there is going into an entrepreneurship. And this is also my context, this is my condition, and then I have to develop my business, and I have to do this with a certain mindset. I was invited to present on the subject, not only of what you've said, a number of keywords, but I missed sustainability in it, and I think probably for Green History it's a big issue. For me it's a very big issue, it's a very big motivation for a lot of things that I do. And the presentation is called Return of Real Space. It links a lot to the technology that Fred has very well introduced, saying that in the 90s when I was doing my studies, real space was this buzzword because we had immediate access, immediate online access to all kinds of things. It's created a connection, a communication connection, that created new communities that you're all introducing. But I think there's also a sort of a backlash where these communities reinvent the need of meeting in physical spaces. My quest is a little bit to know what is the actual value of physical space as a community element, as opposed to, or maybe more or less complementary to new online communities. And it has two parts. One part is sort of a peripheral vision for understanding the kind of complex situation. Architecture and urbanism always has to deal with everything because everything takes place in space, everything we do. And that's why I was asking, who is a designer? You can be a researcher, you can be a servant of many different kinds of services. If you design, you have to know what already exists and how to project that with that existing language into an uncertain future. And the transition that we're going through makes this uncertain future more and more uncertain. So how do we find a way of having a collective vision of that future so that we can do it collaboratively? So that's the part that says co-authoring space community for space planning for community resilience. A lot of things have already been said. I'm going to try to make a small contribution to that in my way. This is an image that I like very much. It's also partly the history of collaboration that already has at least, well, it has an endless history, but this is an architectural project of Caesar in the 80s, and it had come 10 years out of the occupation of Salazar. And you see these women who have that timeless culture. They are doing their daily life. And then there's this project inscribed in the landscape, which is a sort of a comment, not a comment, it's the announcement of a future. It is a solution for a housing problem and of hygiene situation. And these are parallel times. In fact, the women who live their daily life and the architects who have to develop with governance and with everything else new solutions. And this was a collaborative project. It was a cooperative, and they built this project for over 30 years. Very, very laborious, very, very difficult, but very inspiring to me. This is something else that didn't work so very well. I'm going to try to tell you a story about how the article that I was, the title, The Return of Real Space, was an article I was invited to write about the systemic condition of urbanity. So systemic, I'm going to make it very short, systemic is interlinking dynamic systems. Meteorology is a very good example because you have air currents with temperatures, with air pressures, with hygrometry. They interact with water currents, they interact with land masses, and all of this creates clouds or not clouds, and rain and not rain. So these are interlinking systems. And the systemic situation also exists, of course, when you talk about economy and ecology and governance and social inclusion. Here is something that did not work, but I'm going to try to explain how we got to there. And it includes all kinds of different phenomena of society. So here you see some painted, classical painted images of Paris in the beginning of the 19th century, halfway, yeah, about infrastructural works on the quays to receive boats, about food distribution in the markets. And here we're going into photography, it's a little different, but you can see the mobility situation of Paris. Paris, from the 1830s to 60s to 90s, went from 1 million to 2 million to 3 million inhabitants and onwards. So it's an incredibly rapid urbanization with an enormous and non-high-tech solutions to developing the city. So what Haussmann did at a certain point said, we need to have air and light in these houses, we need to have access so we can have safety, and we also need a sanitary system, so we need sewage. So all of this is also, it has an aesthetic result, but it is also a technical need to intervene in an existing situation. And at a certain point, there's a lot of promise from technology coming. Electric light, elevated transport systems. And at a certain point, photography takes over what painting was doing, registering reality. This is Daguerre, who made one of the first photographies in his very early period. He also registered, or his technique registered catastrophes of that society. I'm skipping from society to the arts because the technique of painting was useful for depicting reality. When photography came over, art needed a new agenda. So in this same period of industrial revolution, and a very fast transition, there's art being first classical, becoming impressionist, becoming expressionist. I'm going to carry you into this artistic, totally liberated and totally anarchistic and independent development, which has a lot of influence of how cities have become. So you see Vincent van Gogh adding drama to reality in an expressionist way. And then we're going to Mondrian, my fellow countryman, who adds drama to a windmill and then to an apple tree. And then he keeps on studying this idea of an apple tree. Cubism is a new phase, and all these art movements communicate and develop together. And we're going into an abstraction, and this is parallel to Industrial Revolution. In a way, this is a Taylorist painting. It is going to reducing to the minimum necessary effect to get the maximum message. It's seeking essence. And of course, architecture is part of that artistic or hybrid practice. And there is it's impossible to distinguish these things and say, what is the promise of arts in this technological revolution? And how do the formal mechanisms of art feed back into this creative art of architecture? So this is the Barcelona pavilion. This is 1929. Seems completely timeless. But this looks like this is a gravity-defying project, and it's immaterial, it's pure space, and it's a promise of a future hygienic living space. And you can multiply that, and we can still use artistic promise into a bigger solution for the same urbanization taking place. And it is a sort of co-evolution of wanting to believe in the qualities that are promised and then delivering them to a large growing community, a large number of people. So the Unité d'Habitation of Le Corbusier, I think you all know this project. And if you see the initial project and how it is set in the landscape, it is actually quite promising. It's pretty good. There's just a problem. If you take a weak version of the Unité d'Habitation and you replace neighborhoods like this one in St. Louis in the United States, this is a poor version of the same promise, multiplied to an enormous scale. And this was built in 1956, and it didn't work, so I had to get away. I'm trying to get you through time and through different notions and through different languages to see that all of this takes place in space. And this is what I call systemic in trying to figure out how society works in these historical conditions. But what are the conditions today that we have to deal with? These are all backgrounds that we have to confront ourselves with that require transition for social inclusion, for economical sustainability, global trade, housing issues. This is actually a Chinese mafia-led community that was a spontaneous emergence. It has been taken down because it was not so very safe. These are the questions of global warming, social unrest and violence, and the fact that tourism still takes place in all these parallel developments that are there. And as you already also spoke about the smart city, I'm going to add a little image to that. How do we provide well-being to citizens with all these background contexts? What is it that they need? And in a technological sense, you can quantify it. If we make a smart city and we wire everything together, we can make sure that all these denizens have access to what they need, and we can monitor their consumption, and we can maybe regulate it so that the night and the day, etc., and everything becomes interconnected. But my question is a little bit what the position of the citizen is in that kind of technology. So technology is a solution. It always has been, and it will always be. It's a promise also, and it's also leading us into thinking in a different way. So these are networks. And this kind of global network thinking has probably led to thinking of network organizations. So these are trade routes on sea and on the air, IP connections. This is a 1925 map of telephone cables. So it's been going on for a long while already. And my question is still, what can we? You can think about the connections, and you can think about a lot of ecosystemic words, like ecosystems and resilience and all these kinds of buzzwords that we use, and they actually have a lot to do with where they originally came from, with natural sciences. Resilience is first something in natural sciences. So this is Darwin, it's not for nothing that the Centre in Bordeaux was called after Darwin. His first sketch, 1831, at the same time when Paris was going through a big boom. And he draws out this map of a network. So this network is something that is instantaneous. At a certain point, some species are connected, but it's also evolutionary, so it's also a dynamic system. And then we can go into this kind of more complex visualization of these networks. This is a study that was done because fishing industry said, we don't have any cod to fish anymore because the seals are eating all the cod. And then research comes into place and says, well, actually it's not the seals who are eating all the cod, this is pollution, and it starts at the bottom. So there's a whole myriad of interconnected species, and there's an interesting piece of research that I ran into when I was doing the article, called this diversity stability debate, and I was glad that Paul mentioned diversity yesterday, and think it's interesting to know a little bit more about this diversity. And natural scientists say that if an ecosystem has a wider variety of species, it is more resilient, because if you take one out, the system doesn't collapse. So it's a little bit cruel, because you can't think of society and taking an element out. And I know this, but trying to understand what resilience is saying that if you have a complex system with a lot of variety, with a lot of different partners, with a lot of different participants, you have a system that's much more flexible and adaptive. So it's interesting to have that kind of insight. This is private consulting to United States international politics, using the same kind of visuals, saying that if we want to have a local political agenda, and we want to have stability in Afghanistan, we will have to do with a whole lot of things, including narcotic agendas and financing structures. This is going very far, but what I'm trying to say is that they are connected. There are networks of connection, the networks of evolution, and the networks of interaction. These are organizational maps, according to certain cultures. It's to say that not all the cultures work within the same pattern. I'm not saying this is true or untrue, I'm just saying that it's probably true that different cultures have different ways of interacting. And there's also, let's say, networks of collaborative potential, or governance maps. Maybe blue one is very French, it's very centralized. I'm not going to these kinds of charades of who's who, but I think there's one that is totally networked, which is an IP kind of network where everybody is connected to everybody. And I think space is somewhere in between, because it's a physically limited space where you meet some and not all, and you're not always in connection with everybody. And this is where community gets more sense, because I think this space is the place in which trust, space is, the physical reality is still so much more rich than the digital reality. Some things like body language have so much to do with when you create trust with people you interact with. So I think space has a very specific place in that. If you go back to this network thing, who are the dots? I think that is more important actually than who are the connections. And the dots are the people who work their way into their existence and trying to make their living. This is Alex Hillman. He is a very important figure in the co-working scene. He's just an individual at the start of the beginning. And this is the system that kind of develops around these kinds of individuals. So this is the Bussy co-working we visited in London. This is Fernando, who was supposed to be here with his wife, who runs the co-working in Lisbon. So this becomes a community with, it's not, the manager is not the right word, people who animate these kinds of collectives of workers. So this is a co-working mood board, saying that it's work, it's individuals, it's organization, it's also peripheral activities where this is Paulo Soares de Carvalho, who's a governance...
Smart cities guy.
He's a startup and smart, he's pretty tech, but he's smart enough also to hook into communities and knowing that these are breeding grounds. So this is peripheral to work. And then we go into third places. I'm also going to third places. I was saying that my main motivator is sustainability, but the problem with sustainability is that it doesn't communicate very well with finance. And so we need some kind of common language. And I think the third place is a way of modeling very simply how this community has very many different faces. So it's about, this is a library, street art, work, meetings, all kinds of different activities that are contextualized in the same space. It's not sectorized and saying, this is a housing zone, this is a working zone, this is the commercial center, etc. No, it's coming back together. That's what I think is very interesting. So I've made a little summary that I've kind of appropriated, and I've tried to, it's the same thing as Fred said, easily accessible, inexpensive, comfortable, with regular residents, community-based, open to visitors, and with food and drinks. So these are actually, this is a good agenda to develop that kind of stuff. Now, just before I go into the projects that I'm trying to do with this kind of knowledge, this is a sort of a prolongation of work that was done by Rand McNally, trying to make a chart of billions of years of evolution. This is a logarithmic scale, yeah? But I've kind of copied it and said, okay, so there's first there's plant life, then there's animal life, then comes man, and man creates culture. So this is the first column, yeah? And if we take the last part, then you see the French culture in this blue and white and red, right? And if you take that, that is since Anno Domini, since the Christ, since our calendar, another algorithmic scale. And the part where it flexes in is energy consumption. So this is kind of what's taking place and how we need to see our consumption and sustainability in a long period, and also make it contextual with all kinds of other developments. The part down there is the megawatt scenario in France. There are 4 ways to reduce our consumption. The S stands for sobriety, just consume less. The P stands for more efficient production, so lose less energy while extracting energy. Yeah, okay. I'll go a little faster. Anyways, there is a fragmentation of the economy taking place, and we need to recreate these fragments into communities that can actually work together and sustain the situation. So this is a biotope in the beginning. This is the original territory, and we develop it through the ages into what I call technotope. This is again the same architect who has a technique of inscribing himself into the landscape, which is the original natural landscape. But in fact, we don't have to inscribe ourselves into a technological landscape. We have so much technological residual that we have to deal with that. And this is what I already said. It's inscribing into a physical context, which is technological, and inscribing into a sociological context. I'm going to then quickly go through a couple of projects. I'll try to skip the projects that are not mine and only inspire me, just talk a little bit about the projects that I've done. This is Christchurch. They have rebuilt their community after an earthquake. It's a natural disaster. And this is Detroit, and they're rebuilding their community after a massive industrial rampage. So the industry has just left the city. So, yeah, they're both disastrous, but yeah, they're both disastrous, and they have the same solution, but they don't have the same background. This is an urbanist study which was collaborative. This is about communities, this is working with the community. We made 6 concepts that were presented to the 10 departments of the City Hall. And we had a scoreboard saying which are the concepts that you believe most in. And from that part, we started to develop a cartography of all the impacts on the site, and then developed a formal intervention that was actually put on. Can you see the yellow patches? Which is where actually the soil was the most adapted for receiving construction. And this is a visual impression of what that element could be like. It has a historical background and it has a landscape background. And it's trying to, it's a good example of how we develop this design, not as designers, but together with the designers of the municipality. Also, community work should maybe learn from other design disciplines. Stakeholder maps and customer journeys are used in user experience development in web and in product design and service design, and I think it's a good lesson we can learn for architecture, trying to have tools to do this collaboratively. I can't go into the detail, but this is the positive and negative experience of somebody buying a cell phone. So it's a trajectory of experience, and I think architecture should maybe also look at that. Mixed use, this is a massive project, I won't discuss it. This is Darwin, third place, mixing use. This is a commission that I had very recently to try to imagine and also financially estimate the work needs to be done for a sports rink, a sports arena, and to make it into a theatre venue as well, reversible. So there is a very small physical intervention, totally strategic, for one and the other to exist, and a couple of visuals to imagine what that space could be like. But mostly it's also an enormous Excel sheet of saying, if you choose this, it costs you this much, and it has to do with... So it's a lot of... The process is very easy, but it has to be somehow supported with actual financial models. This is a very beautiful, passive and positive pavilion in Spain that I didn't make. But it's very inspiring because it's sculptural and it's ecological. Thank you very much. This is a project that I did study together with some engineers trying to bring passive house to the southwest of France. And this is where frustration hits in, because it is a logic that costs little money, but because you can't sell technology with this project, it's impossible to sell to industry. You're telling them there's a solution for you to make less money and to spend less energy, and they just won't buy into it. So you can do all the studies that you like. For example, saying it has to be oriented to the south, so it always catches the sun, and you have to have one model that can be serially produced, and it has to fit into the landscape. It has to be adapted to the south, because we need ancestral techniques from the Mediterranean to protect us from the heat. And this is a model where it says, if we could just make a simple envelope that is prepared to be passive, with simple interventions, we can upgrade this house that somebody has bought with his very dear money, with a bank account, etc. With a small amount of money, you can upgrade it into a passive house so that he has to spend 5,000 euros maybe in 5 years when energy prices will be going up. And 10 years later, he can maybe have some solar panels so that they can be injected into the system, so they can be autonomous. What can you sell to the market now that will have that logic, so we don't have to redo it all the time? But it's something that doesn't go very well with the industry. This is low-tech in construction, so it's just a simple box, a wooden box with prefabricated elements. When I did this project, I had to import them from Austria, but now in France, in my region, there is a local manufacturer of these kinds of panels with local wood. So I've experienced this technique now, and I can propose it, and it makes my job simpler because all the holes are already in place. I don't have to explain to the plumber where he has to put his stuff. And then the adaptive part. This is the minimum viable project that Dinko was talking. Dinko? Yeah, was talking about this. It's just a small schematic saying, I need a car. How do I make a car? Well, I need a wheel, and I need a frame with another wheel, and then I need a body, and then I have a car. And all the steps before you have the car are useless. And the other scheme is the same thing. I need to move. I can do it with a skateboard, or with a trottinette, or with a bike. And so you're upgrading this same solution towards an end solution. That the meantime is always occupied, is always functional. So there's a technical way of looking at it. There's also a physical, spatial way of looking at it. This is in 2001, the cultural capital in Rotterdam. It's not my project, but it was very nice to have this kind of a symbol on the roofscape in 2001 for an event, changing the minds of designers, saying it could be something that we can then extend into a physical and permanent development. And this is actually a property developer who had the permit to build a very large pavilion on the roof. This is a project that I did do for the cultural capital. This was their headquarters. This is a temporary use. And if we would take the budget and spread it over the 3,000 square meters we had to do it, we would have the budget to make a new tapestry on the ground, and a new ceiling and lighting, and some security measures, and that was it. So we would spend all our money on actually virtually nothing. What we did is we concentrated all the money in the strategic element, and which is this box. You can see that box. It's sort of an enormous light fixture, integrating also security measures, but also panels for posters and for video presentations. So it is really concentrated financially to a simple solution. This is where the money went for 3,000 square meters. It only went into these objects. And the way of reasoning in it was to say, in these four images, this is the yellow dart is the spot. And the concentric circles are where people become pedestrians. So they come out of a tram, out of a train, out of a car or something, and they become inhabitants of the public space. And the stars are their cultural objectives, if they want to go to a cultural place. And then you map the most important public space, and you see that the location that we were proposed to work with was completely in the heart of everybody that was looking for culture in Rotterdam in 2001. So you're saying there's a lot of exposure. You need to have another way of dealing with your budget. You can't just make tapestry and a ceiling and done with it. You need something a lot more visual. And this is the last one. the origin of spaces and made me work with an economist and with a sociologist and with people in communication. Together we've taken the initiative to create an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary consulting group. And this is our first commission where we co-wrote a paragraph in a development program for urban renewal. This is 3 acres of urban renewal, being amenities, public administration, housing, and education. So this is a big developer saying, I don't know how to sell my commercial space. But there is commercial space existing on the top level. So the intensity of blue is the attractivity of the commercial area. And what we're saying is that if you take local energy, as in third places, as in co-working places, as in small entrepreneurs who have all these needs, and you get them together, the fact that they are here on the site, the fact that they are so close to the metro line and so close to the commercial area, you can create a public pedestrian flux into this new area and then kind of stretch this attractivity into the whole urban area. So this is just, it's not such an incredible invention, but visualizing it and trying to contextualize it helps to create another kind of argument, another kind of way of, it's not writing, but it's creating a language, a common language for people to collaborate on the same subjects, but maybe with some new tools. So, this is the last one, sorry. In fact, urbanism taking 15 years is the last one, promise. Urbanism taking 15 years, there's a lot of questions about the meanwhile. Can we wait 15 years for an area to be realized and say, now you can occupy it? Or should we maybe reason that it is already occupied as soon as it is a building site? So there was a study to look into what kind of amenities area could we add to a housing area, having a certain shape. This was the objective. But if you put the first building there, one of the 6, and you use it as building construction type barracks for stocking materials or having meetings and having showers, etc., you can have a temporary use. Then develop it into an exhibition area for selling the houses, so that new population is going into the area. It's going to meet the area before the buildings are ready. But in fact, you've kind of provided a space, or a third space, a third place for people to meet. But you're not just saying, okay, we'll do the work and then you can come. You're mixing it immediately, and so you're maintaining a sort of societal impact all along the way. So I think this is probably the end. Thank you very much.
Presentation of Rojc from Oldenburg, Croatia, about head of the Office for Culture, and Marco from European Capital of Culture Project will represent the cultural project of Pula related to community and space.
Right. It's me again. Thank you everybody who listened to the panel yesterday and then danced the night away as well. We're here this morning, which is a good sign. I've only got 4 pictures and I want to tell you some stories about those pictures. It really neatly follows on from what these 2 guys have said. Fred particularly, thank you for, for being so complimentary about things. But I didn't know Fred until what, 2 years ago maybe, with that? The IT centre that he talked about, I joined Lewisham and I was responsible for funding one of those centres. I never met Fred. This was all through the government structure of funding for regeneration of an estate, and part of that was about let's set up a community IT centre in it. Me as a simple local boy didn't really pick up this wider government agenda that was going on. And believe it or not, there was this man here who was driving it. And it's really interesting that 15 years after that happened, I get to meet the guy that I funded the thing that he was pushing. And I think this is really the story that I want to tell you. That things happen, but they happen quite slowly. But then you see all these connections of things that have gone on. The river work that Fred was so generous about actually started off with community groups really having a go at us as a local authority. Why aren't you doing this? This is a wonderful natural resource. Why are you giving it over to developers? Why are you not protecting? And some of my colleagues in Lewisham really got hold of that. And they, as local residents, could see that argument, and they really began pushing it as an agenda within Lewisham. So that when I put in a proposal to get some European funding to do some river restoration work, all that groundwork, all of that energy that had gone into sort of knocking on the council's door and saying, why don't you do this? We were ready to do something. And that has turned into Lewisham Council being nationally recognised as a leader in river restoration and river management in the UK and across Europe. And actually, I need to acknowledge that that started with the community. And we are just a tool to help deliver that. And obviously we benefit from that as a local authority as well. But that's taken 15 years. And it happens, and we do see those links that are on your, the dots and the lines between them. Sometimes they're very faint. You don't quite see, or you're not really with the full picture, but it's there. It's brilliant that I'm, working on a project with Fred now, and revisiting all these things and seeing links that we weren't really aware of at the time, and how they've worked together to put us into the position that we are now. And one of those things is about reuse of public buildings, which is what we're here to discuss. The building straight ahead on that is the Mayor's Office and the Civic Suite in Lewisham. So I explained yesterday, within London, 32 different municipalities, all with their own autonomous political structure. It gets confusing. But we've all got buildings, we've all got town halls, we've all got offices for our mayors. The building slightly to the left was where we as officers would work. In the 80s, it was too small. We built another building across the road. Things have changed. Now we've got too many buildings, so we shut down the old one, moved everybody into the new building. The question was, what do we do with that old building on the left-hand side? My colleagues who were here over the last few days working on the Origins of Spaces project thought, you know what, we've got a real need in our community and our borough for space for micro businesses and micro entrepreneurs. At that point, I don't think we talked about co-working as a concept. I don't think we really knew quite what it was we wanted, but we knew there was a need. We put it to our senior managers, we could do something with this space. The reaction was, oh, it's too expensive, or we've never done that before, or it's a bit of a risk, isn't it? We're trying to save money, you wanted to spend more money on changing the function of a building? Oof, sorry, we're going to close it down, we're going to mothball it, and then maybe in 5 years' time, we've got a big plan for regeneration of the area, it's going to be knocked down anyway, so why waste money on the building now? After about 6 months it became apparent that the cost of keeping that building empty was prohibitive. They suddenly came back to us as a team and said, you know that idea you had, we might need to develop it a little bit more. We might actually need to use that space because the plans for regenerating the area, that nearly was a dangerous one, wasn't it? Isn't 5 years now, it's 10 years. So we can have an empty building for 10 years. It might be longer because finances are down, the developers are changing their mind about what we want. We can't get the support from the central government or the Mayor for London. So maybe we have to revisit what we do with that building. And I'm really pleased that those original ideas that the guys in our team had are now coming to fruition. And a 5-floor building, 3 floors are given over to a local housing organisation. Top 2 floors will become enterprise space, a co-working hub. And I really hope that we fully understand the language of co-working and the benefits that that will bring. And by the summer, if you come over, that should be 2 floors, thriving local entrepreneurs who need space, because we've got the biggest concentration of micro businesses in the UK in our borough. They all work in their homes, they all need something else. And through the Origin of Spaces project, we've begun to see as an authority the value of co-working, the value of that mash of different people together. So, next picture. This will be my last one. Fred showed you a mock-up of this. This is, unfortunately, a slightly blurred photo of it on site. And this is, no, that's it, it's only these 2 slides, you're okay. So this is, again, us as a local authority being influenced by stuff that's going on around and thinking, you know what, we could do something here. This was the site of an old leisure centre that became unfit for purpose and was demolished. There are plans for that site, but it's politically controversial what it might be used for. So again, the guys in the economic development team said, well, we know what it can be used for. The guys from the housing department said, we've got a real lack of good quality, affordable housing in our borough, particularly for families who are being made homeless. So the idea, taking on the whole concept of meanwhile space, was rather than leaving a big empty space in quite a prominent part of the borough, was saying, well, let's do something that we've not done before, but we think it's got some potential. And I think some of that again came out of communities telling us, you can't do that, you can't just knock a building down and leave it empty. You know, we've got so much need in our community. And those needs were again for about housing and about business space. So these are modelled on sort of those container housing estates that you see around. Temporary use buildings to provide housing for homeless families in the borough, and the bottom space, enterprise space, and some more co-working space. Because suddenly we thought we can't just have one co-working thing in the old town hall. There's so much need for it. We need 2 or 3 different sites across the borough. We need to link that up as well. What's really exciting for me about this is, I think, Christian, you were saying about those last couple of slides, you had a use for the space as it was being developed. We've done the same. Opened up one of the sites at the bottom so that as people are coming along, they can, oh, what's going on here? Talk to someone about it. Get involved, get engaged, understand what it is that's happening, so that it's not suddenly it's arrived and it's open and everybody has to learn what it is. And the idea being, I think there's a 5-year lifespan on this site at the moment. That's probably likely to change. But when it does change, or when that site is ready to be developed into a needed civic site, could be a school, it could be another leisure centre, we're not really sure yet. All those things can be moved somewhere else. And one of the benefits we have in Lewisham is that we do have a few sites for development. And we've now got this as a model, as a transferable model, that we can literally pick up and move somewhere else in the borough at some point. And I think, really just to sum up, that actually local government can given the circumstances and the support, be quite creative in the way that we do things. But what I would say from a local authority perspective is to remember actually a lot of that has come out of community telling us what it is that needs doing, and it takes us a little while sometimes to appreciate that. But when we do get hold of it, we do take it on. I think that joint approach to development can result in some quite innovative ways of working. Thank you.
Sada ćemo imati pauzu. We will have a break now and after we will continue. Okay? 20 minutes.